For generations, long before archaeologists ever set foot in northwestern New Mexico, the Zuni people preserved an extraordinary tradition about the canyon we now call Chaco. They spoke of a journey out of the earth itself, a migration guided by their ancestors through flood and conflict toward a place they called the Middle Place. Not a symbolic story passed down for entertainment, but a literal record of where their people came from and why certain rooms, certain floors, certain chambers were built to be sealed and never casually opened again. Then, in February of 2017, a team of scientists published something that sounded strangely familiar. Buried beneath the floor of a single room inside the largest structure in Chaco Canyon, they said, were the remains of a ruling family, related through the mother's line, in power for more than 300 years. Was the science simply confirming what modern genetics could finally measure? Or had it stumbled onto something the Zuni had been telling us all along? Today we're examining the records, the excavation, and the tradition that all point to the same sealed room. Let's start with what the Zuni say, because most documentaries about Chaco skip straight to the ruins and treat the people who actually descend from them as an afterthought. The Zuni do not experience their own history as a mystery. Their origin story describes an emergence from an underworld, often placed near Ribbon Falls along Bright Angel Creek inside the Grand Canyon, where the ancestors climbed upward through a series of earlier worlds before reaching this one. From there, the story becomes a migration, a long and difficult journey along rivers, including the Little Colorado, marked by floods, by conflict, and by trials that tested the people before they were allowed to settle. That migration ends at Halona Itiwana, the Middle Place, which is the heart of the Zuni homeland today. This story isn't kept as folklore, it's preserved through Kiva societies and clans, and each clan maintains its own version of the route, its own specific waypoints, its own explanation for why its members carry the responsibilities they do. Chaco Canyon sits inside that migration as a real, remembered stop, not a lost civilization the Zuni need archaeology to explain to them. The vocabulary matters here too. The underground ceremonial chambers scattered across the southwest are called kivas, and at the center of a kiva's floor is a small hole known as a sipapu, the place of emergence. It represents the point where the ancestors first stepped up out of the previous world into this one, and it's treated as sacred ground, not decoration. According to Zuni tradition, offerings were placed into that hole, almost always turquoise in shell, and that practice goes back astonishingly far. Turquoise was found placed beneath the roof supports of a great kiva built in Chaco Canyon in the early 1500s, sometime in the early 500s AD, centuries before Pueblo Bonito, the canyon's largest structure, was ever built. Much of what the outside world knows about this tradition passed through one very specific source. An ethnographer named Frank Hamilton Cushing lived at Zuni Pueblo from 1879 to 1884. He didn't just observe from a respectful distance, he adopted Zuni dress and customs, and he was formally initiated into several religious societies, which gave him access to sacred emergence narratives that outsiders were never supposed to hear. Nearly everything written about Zuni cosmology in the following century traces back in one way or another to what one insider-outsider was permitted to record during those 5 years. Before we go further, if you enjoy documentaries that dig past the surface-level version of Southwestern mysteries, consider subscribing. It helps the channel keep researching stories like this one. Now let's turn to what archaeologists actually found beneath the floor of Chaco Canyon, because the physical evidence has its own strange history, and it starts more than a century before that 2017 DNA study ever made headlines. In 1896, a team led by George Pepper, working for the Hyde Exploring Expedition, began digging into Pueblo Bonito, the largest great house in Chaco Canyon, a structure with nearly 650 rooms. In the oldest section of the Pueblo, they broke into a small chamber that would later be labeled Room 33. What they found inside escalated fast. First came the structure itself, a cramped room, roughly 6 feet by 6 feet, tucked deep in the oldest part of the complex, accessible only by passing through 2 other rooms first. Then came the everyday and the ceremonial mixed together, More than 100 cylinder-shaped ceramic vessels found in an adjoining room, vessels that would later test positive for cacao residue, meaning the people at Chaco were drinking a chocolate beverage imported from Mesoamerica more than 1,000 miles away. Then came the human remains, 14 individuals in total, with 2 of them buried beneath a rare wooden plank floor surrounded by thousands of turquoise and shell beads, a conch shell trumpet likely from the Pacific coast, and the remains of scarlet macaws, birds with no natural range anywhere near New Mexico. And then came the detail almost nobody mentions. The lowest of the 2 bodies had a gash in the skull. Researchers still debate whether he was struck during a violent conflict, or whether the wound came later from a shovel, possibly a looter's, breaking through the skull long after burial. Radiocarbon dating on macaw remains from elsewhere in the Pueblo later showed that some of these exotic imports were arriving as early as the late 800s, a full century before Chaco's main construction boom, meaning this trade network in birds, chocolate, and turquoise was already running before Pueblo Bonito became the massive complex we picture today. Then something unusual happened. The story simply went quiet. The bones and artifacts from Room 33 were shipped east to the American Museum of Natural History, packed into boxes and drawers, and for more than 100 years, that's largely where they stayed. No major follow-up, no definitive answer to the obvious question hanging over the room. Who were these 14 people, and why were they sealed away beneath a plank floor in the oldest, most inaccessible corner of the largest building in the canyon? So if this crypt really held the answer to who ran Chaco Canyon, where were the records? For more than a century, the honest answer was that there weren't any, not the kind that could settle the question. Archaeologists debated for decades whether Chacoan society was an egalitarian community without formal rulers, or something closer to a hierarchy, even a kingdom, and Room 33 sat at the center of that argument without resolving it. For many researchers, that gap was frustrating enough to set the mystery aside, but others kept pointing out that the bones themselves hadn't actually finished telling their story. In 2017, a team led by Douglas Kennett at Penn State combined radiocarbon dating with ancient DNA extracted from 9 of the individuals in Room 33. Every single one of them shared an identical mitochondrial genome, a rare genetic marker called haplotype B2Y1, meaning every person tested descended from the same woman along an unbroken maternal line for more than 300 years. As one archaeologist not involved in the study put it at the time, if the results held up, it was a game changer, because proving hereditary leadership in a society with no writing system is normally close to impossible. That's when the second wave of coverage hit. National Geographic, Scientific American, and outlets across the country ran the story as confirmation of a matrilineal dynasty ruling the most powerful building in the ancient Southwest. But almost immediately, a different kind of scrutiny followed, and this is the part that gets left out of most retellings. Several anthropologists and geneticists criticized the study, not for its methods, but for what it skipped entirely. The researchers never consulted the living Pueblo and Indian communities, including the Zuni, Hopi, Navajo, and Acoma, before testing DNA extracted from ancestors those communities still claim today. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act exists precisely to prevent this kind of research from happening without that consultation, and critics argued the study had sidestepped it. So we're left with 2 separate facts that people tend to blur together. That the DNA data itself is real and peer-reviewed is not in dispute. Whether the conclusions drawn from it and the way they were obtained deserve to stand unchallenged is a very different question, and that question is still unresolved. It's worth remembering, too, just how much of Chaco remains literally sealed from view even now. At least 2 court kivas inside Pueblo Bonito had floor vaults built specifically to hold ritual offerings out of sight permanently, one of them noted only in an excavator's unpublished field notes from nearly a century ago. And the canyon's largest kiva, Casa Rinconada, still has a 39-foot underground passage cut directly through sandstone, likely built so a performer could vanish and reappear during a ceremony, undetected until the exact right moment. Missing records and hidden chambers don't automatically mean a conspiracy. Sometimes a passage is simply built to be hidden on purpose by design and stays that way for 1,000 years. Now let's put the two threads side by side because the parallel is hard to ignore. The Zuni tradition describes offerings of turquoise and shell placed at the sipapu, the sacred point of emergence, honoring ancestral lines going back to the moment the people first entered this world. The DNA evidence describes a room packed with turquoise and shell, sealed around the remains of an ancestral line traced entirely through the mother, going back 300 years. The tradition describes matrilineal descent as central to Pueblo social identity long before anyone had a name for mitochondrial DNA. The lab results describe a matrilineal dynasty as if it were a brand new discovery. None of those parallels prove that Room 33 is a literal, deliberate echo of a specific migration story. But they do raise a real question. How much of what genetics is only now confirming was something these communities already knew and had simply never been asked about? And in 2025, that question got even harder to wave away. A separate study on Picuris Pueblo, a living community in New Mexico, found a modern individual carrying that exact same rare haplotype B2Y1 and found that person genetically closer to the ancient Room 33 burials than to any other population ever sampled. That's not folklore lining up with speculation. That's a living person today, carrying the same maternal genetic thread as the people sealed beneath that plank floor 900 years ago. More than 100 years of excavation have gone into Chaco Canyon. Researchers have mapped its roads, dated its timbers, traced its trade goods back to Mesoamerica, and sequenced DNA from bones that sat in museum drawers for a century. And despite every bit of that work, the basic question of what kind of society ruled from Pueblo Bonito, egalitarian or hierarchical, and who had the right to decide that question in the first place, is still not settled. Many of the tribes who trace their lineage to Chaco, including the Zuni, Hopi, Navajo, and Acoma, have been clear that they don't see the canyon as a puzzle waiting to be solved by outsiders. They see it as an ancestral home that deserves protection, with or without a final scientific verdict attached to it. Throughout this video, we've looked at three very different kinds of evidence: an oral tradition preserved for centuries through clan and kiva societies, a physical excavation that sat half forgotten for over 100 years, and a genetic study that reopened the question while opening an entirely new ethical one. Each tells part of the story. None of them on its own settles it. Perhaps the 14 people sealed beneath that plank floor really were the ruling family the DNA suggests. Their power passed mother to daughter for 3 centuries in a story too important to write down. Or perhaps the deeper truth was never really lost at all, only waiting for the people who already knew it to be asked. What can't be debated is that the Zuni migration tradition has survived for longer than the United States has existed as a country, carried person to person, generation to generation, without ever needing a laboratory to confirm it. Perhaps that's why Chaco Canyon keeps pulling people back, not because every mystery inside it has finally been solved, but because every generation, ancient and modern alike, keeps returning to the same sealed room, asking the same question.